If you're looking at your photographs and you find that technically they work, you've got good exposure, you've got everything that you can do technically seems to be correct, but they just don't have quite the same impact. This is where you need to start thinking emotionally, creatively, and understanding the elements that make a photograph that stops people in their tracks. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Hi, my name is William Beem. I am a photographer in Central Florida. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been here before, welcome back. We really appreciate you. And I'm glad that we gave you something to help you come back. Today, what we want to talk about are 10 elements of composition that you can use to make more interesting and to make more compelling photographs for your audience. And that part is very particular. Not everybody is going to love everything you do, no matter how well you do it. But if you can develop an audience, give them something they enjoy seeing, give them something that gives them an emotional connection, something that they love, then you're on your way to having more compelling photographs. And I think some of the tips that we're going to give you in this video are going to help you out. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? And why do you want to worry about these elements of composition? It's not the kind of stuff that we usually talk about with leading lines and rule of thirds. Those are important things. They're good to get you started, but they're kind of like training wheels. After a while, you outgrow them and you either do them by nature or you're looking for something to grow beyond. What we're going to talk about here is to grow beyond. So think about it. When you come across a scene or maybe a person that you want to take as a portrait, what goes to your mind? You want to capture it right away? If you're looking to capture Bigfoot, okay, that makes sense because Bigfoot's not going to stick around. But if you've got some time, start working the scene. Start looking at it as if you were looking at a photograph. Start thinking about, what is someone in my audience going to want to see? Is it going to be the color, the lighting? Is it going to be how I compose the scene from high or low or left or right, whatever angle I'm going to be coming up with? You want to think about that, but then there are other things that you want to think about that are a bit more creative. So let's start with the first one, unity. When we think about unity in photograph, what we're talking about are common elements, things that unify everything together, things that make you understand that everything here belongs here and nothing that doesn't belong here is here. You might be going minimalist or you might not, but the idea is that you want to eliminate things that don't belong. You want to have unifying elements. And some of this you can do in post-processing, perhaps with a color grading. But when you're taking your composition, color grading isn't exactly what's going to help you out. You need to look for things that belong in the scene. So let me give you a couple of examples. Here's a photograph of London. If you look at it, to me, this is just a hot mess. You have buildings with different types of architecture. You have some that are old. You have a few that are new. You have different styles. You have cranes going all through the line. There's nothing about this photograph that says, look here, pay attention to me. Or if this were a travel photo, would you really want to go to a place that looks like this photograph? Let's take a look at another photograph. This is in Santorini. There's a common color theme. There's a common architectural style. Everything in this photo looks like this is a place, and everything in this place looks like it belongs together. And that's what I'm talking about when I say unity. You're looking for things where even if it's not your main subject, something is supporting your main subject. Everything goes together. And that's what you see when you look at this scene. Even though there are a couple of different colors in here, there's a sense of style, there's a sense of unity that this is a community rather than just a mishmash of different buildings from different places that have no relationship to one another. So unity, think about relationships, think about style, think about colors, everything goes together. The next thing on our list is balance. And balance can work kind of like visual weight. And depending upon your needs, you can do this in different ways. You can do this with symmetry or asymmetry. In other words, everything is lined up perfectly, or maybe something is just a little bit off kilter. You can work with balance in your concept, in the tone, in the color. Let me give you an example here. This is a photograph I took at the Lincoln Memorial. And what I was going for here was mostly symmetry with the building itself. But I also like the fact that there was a man who was sitting on the upper end of the stairs, and it just kind of threw everything off just a little bit. So there's symmetry and asymmetry in the same photograph. Again, you still have unity. Everything belongs here. Everything is exactly as it should be. There's nothing in this photograph that shouldn't be here because it isn't part of the scene that I'm looking at. And it's not filled with tourists, going all over the place. That, depending upon your need, maybe you do need tourists to show that this is a travel destination. But what I wanted was to show just a simple, peaceful morning. And I got lucky that this gentleman was sitting up there because that provided exactly what I was looking for. So when you're looking for balance, you're thinking about balance, not just visual weight on one side of the photograph or the other. You're thinking about when somebody looks at this, is everything lining up? Is everything purposely or unpurposely set askew? So we talked about asymmetry. Not everything has to be perfect symmetry. Sometimes that works. Sometimes you really want things out of balance. Sometimes you want to give visual weight to one side because maybe you're going to put some text or do something else on the other side. So think about your purpose for your photograph, and then think about how you're going to balance elements in the final piece that goes out that people are looking at. The next item we're going to talk about is movement. And you think of photographs as being still. That doesn't mean that you cannot convey a sense of movement. And I think movement is very interesting in a photograph. If you can give somebody the concept that something's moving. The way you do that might be with blur and it may be without. So for example, if you think of some of the classic photos where somebody's hopping over a puddle, there's movement. And then there's a kind of a question in your mind. Does he make it over the puddle or does he not? But you can also use movement with motion blur. So take a look at the photograph I have here. There is a tractor trailer rig, and you can tell by the blur that it conveys a sense of movement. The only part that doesn't are the front wheels or tires. That could be the fact that maybe this was parked and somebody did a blur filter in Photoshop, or maybe that they had a light that just flashed and captured it right there. But overall, when somebody's looking at this, they're not thinking about that tire. They're thinking about this truck is moving. This truck is going very fast. And it's not necessarily the speed. I've got photographs of dancers where just a shake of a hip is a little bit blurry and you show some movement there. So it depends on what your subject is. If movement is appropriate, it's a way of getting attention. It's something you could include inside of your compositions. So if there's a way to convey movement, and think about this, people do this with long exposures. You're showing water moving by giving a long exposure, and you see the blur and the white highlights that come up. People do the same thing with clouds. So just because you're taking a still image of a location, for example, doesn't mean that there's no sign of movement. The next item on the list I wanted to talk about is rhythm. And this is, think of repeated scenes or repeated elements in your scene. And I'm going to give you a couple of photographs to take a look at the difference between something that lacks rhythm and something that has a bit of a rhythm going with it. So you can use this to show progress. You can use this to show direction. A flight of stairs is probably one of the simplest examples. You know that there's repeated steps going off, but they're also going off in a direction. So let's take a look at, this is a view of a parking lot. And if you look at this, this is just people are parked wherever they're parked. There's really no rhythm here. It's a rather chaotic scene. And quite honestly, there's no visual interest to something like this. Now let's take a look at another scene. This one's a bit different. You've got a bit of balance and out of balance. You've got all the cars are parking perfectly within a spot. And then you've got an empty spot that kind of grabs your attention and pulls it away. Now let's take a look at one more example of how to do something like this. If you're going to have a pattern, think about a pattern that's interrupted. In other words, all of these cars are the same color except for one, and that one stands out. If you can find a pattern and interrupt it a bit, that is visual interest. That's part of a composition that you go in and draw somebody's eye, and they'll notice that. If all of these cars were the same color, it's like, yeah, you've got a pattern, but interrupting the pattern is probably one of the best things you can do. Think about this with rhythm. It's not the subject. It's like the seasoning on your meal. In other words, it gives it a bit of flavor. It helps you offset your subject and make it interesting. So think of rhythm as a way to season the flavor of your photograph. All right, one thing I haven't mentioned, of course, is subject. And your subject could be a person, it could be a group of people, it could be a place, it could be a thing. Any person, place, or thing is a subject. But what do you really need? Every photograph needs a subject, an interesting background, and good lighting. And if you think about it, if you have good lighting and an interesting background, you can replace the subject and the subject almost doesn't matter. You think of the subject as the most important thing in your photograph, but what's really important is the setting and the lighting. And then you put in an appropriate subject. So sometimes you might have to walk around and say, yeah, there's an interesting subject, but if I have a cluttered background, it's not so interesting. If I don't have good light, the subject's not so interesting. So think about your subject, but your subject in an appropriate setting. So subject, light, background. Make sure you get all those right, and you'll have a great shot of a compelling photograph. So let's take a couple of looks at some photographs here. All right, the first one, we've got a gentleman here. He's got light on his face. The background puts him in context, but he is not cluttered in the background. In other words, that little cabinet behind him doesn't interfere with him at all. I'd say, if anything, that little circular light kind of in the center of the frame and those hot spots over there on the left side, kind of a third way down, if I could eliminate anything, that's what I would take out of this photograph. But otherwise, I think this is just a really great photo of an interesting man. Now let's take a look at one more. This one, you've got a couple of people. So which one is your subject? Well, it's not really one person or the other. It's the couple that makes the subject. And just think of it that way. So what does that tell you? You want to have an interesting background behind the couple. You want to have good lighting on the couple. So you don't want to have it so one person is lit very well and another person isn't, or any other obstruction or any other distraction. If the couple is your subject, then make sure that you're lighting them and putting a good background behind them. And in the case in this one, the rope doesn't bother me so much that's going behind them. Typically, I would try to avoid anything that merges inside of somebody's head. But the idea is here, if you look at this photograph, I think you've got good lighting, you've got a good expression and emotion, and you've got a really good subject. So I think that's something that you want to look at. The next item on our list is contrast. If you want to grab visual attention, you want to look for contrast. There are different ways to add contrast. You can add tonal contrast, which is what most people think about, their highlights and their shadows. You can add color contrast. So in other words, you can look at the color wheel and say, what are the opposites on the color wheel, and put those together in your photograph, and you have contrast. And you can look at emotional contrast. You can look at anything where you have something that's a bit opposite, and that provides a bit of contrast in your photograph. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So in this one, you have a dancer. She's got contrast against the wall. The wall is dark. Her skin pops off of it. The red shoes and top kind of pops right off of that. She works with that because of the contrast that we're seeing in this photograph. This photograph is a much simpler view. You've got to look at a red deer with some big antlers, but the sky is the contrast. It's not so much that the grass in the foreground, he belongs in his environment, but he stands out because of that cool color in the sky. And that warm and cool contrast is a good way to make your photo stand out. All right, next up on our list is proportion. And you can use proportion for a number of things. You can use it for exaggeration. You can use it for comparison. You can use it to make something stand out. So let's take a look at this photograph. This is my friend Colleen. She lives in New York, and she takes pictures of rubber ducks. So what we've done here is we've gone up to the top of the Empire State Building, and she's got her rubber duck that's kind of like the New York one with the Statue of Liberty. I used a very wide angle lens here. So she looks fine, the people behind her look fine, but anything that's closer to your lens is going to be more exaggerated. And that is exactly what I wanted. So her hand looks huge, the rubber duck looks huge in proportion to everything else around there. I wanted that duck to stand out. So you can use that to exemplify your message or your subject, or something that's interesting or supporting of your subject. So in this case, Colleen is my subject, but Colleen is kind of all about New York City and rubber ducks, at least the time that I took this photograph. So that was why I did this technique. So your lens choice can have a big impact when you think about what's closest to the lens and what's furthest from the lens, and how you set up relationships. People use this with trick photos all the time. So you might see somebody in Italy next to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and they're acting like they're holding the thing up. That's a good example of proportion. You can see the same thing with somebody who's trying to hold the moon or the sun in their hands. They're looking at proportion. Obviously, the moon and the sun are extremely large, but since they're far away, they seem small. And with the right angle, with the right lens, you can kind of make things look a little bit different than they actually are by the way we see them and with our own eyes. Number 8 on our list, space. It's not the final frontier, but sometimes you need space. Maybe you're going to put something in your photograph afterward. We've mentioned text previously, but sometimes you want to give your subject space so that it looks like that they could travel across the photo. In other words, well, take a look at this photograph of a young woman, and you've got two things going on with space. You've got active space, which is the space on the left. That's where she's looking. And you've got dead space, which is behind her. You want to have more active space, I would say, than dead space. The idea, like if she were reversed and she were looking off the edge of the frame, your viewer is going to tend to look right out of the photo. It's just a subconscious thing that we do. If you want to get someone's attention in there, leave some active space, particularly if you have a moving subject. So you can combine this with motion, and you may want to have some space. If you have a race car, a motorcycle, someone running, you want the direction that they're going to have more space, that the imagination will imagine your subject moving forward across the frame. So that's the idea. Have some space, eliminate clutter, eliminate wasted stuff that may interfere with your subject, and give them some active space to move across the frame. All right, the next one on our list is texture. This is one of my favorites because we can all relate to textures because they're objects that we know. We know how they look. We know how they feel. Also, texture does a very good job of catching light and blocking it in some places where we have light and shadow. We can almost sense the dimension. Remember, our photographs are two-dimensional. We can't touch them and feel anything, but we can look at them and think, subconsciously, I know what that's supposed to look like. Food photos are a good example of this. So here's something that we're looking at the background, this dark wooden table, and you can see there's texture there. It adds a little bit of drama to the food itself. You can have the most boring subject in the world and put texture around it and bring it to life. And I know this because my wife, Lee, likes to take photos of a cup of coffee. Coffee is just brown water. It's dark. There's nothing lively about it, as long as you're not doing like a cappuccino with all the foam and stuff on it. She's taking photos of coffee. And the idea is, it's not about the coffee. It's about that first cup of coffee in the morning. It's about the experience. To make that experience work, she does flat lay photography like this and puts textured items around it. So the spoon with the sugar in it, maybe a napkin, maybe a cloth underneath, whatever it is that she puts there, those textures make the experience come true. So you can do this, for example, not just with food. This is one of my favorite examples with food. Let's go ahead and get another angle on a different food photography composition. And you see the pomegranates. What you're trying to do is you're trying to trigger something inside of a person's head that they remember or they know, and you're trying to bring that out of them. They're not thinking about the seeds inside of a pomegranate, but once you show them and you see how the light and shadow falls off, it's almost like they can reach in and touch it. That's what texture does for you. And remember, it doesn't have to be about food. Food is just a very good example for using this, but if you can add texture in your photographs, then you trigger memories of people that know what that tactile response should be if they were able to touch what's inside your photograph. The last item on our list is dimension. In other words, we're looking for depth and dimension. We're trying to make our flat photograph look like something real. The way to do that is to have a foreground, a middle, and a background. Landscape photographers generally know this. Let me show you an example of a landscape photo. And this is a snowy scene. And you can see in the foreground, we have water. In the middle, we have these colorful houses. And in the background, there's the snowy winter landscape. That adds dimension. In other words, you're looking for something that people can say, I'm looking at a window rather than just looking at a flat photograph. You want the lighting, you want the areas of interest to progress from the front to the back. It doesn't matter if your subject is in the foreground, in the middle, or the background. What matters is you give a sense of progression, dimension, and depth. Now, dimension can come from the foreground, middle, and background. It can also come from your lighting. So as we saw in the previous photograph with the pomegranates, there's more light on one side and it gradually fades off. That's another way to add dimension. It's kind of like artists use shading. They're mimicking what the light looks like. You can add 3D look to your photographs. If you can add depth where they go from foreground to background, then you're making someone have an acceptable illusion that they're just looking out a window when they're actually looking at your photograph. All right, those were our 10 elements of composition. Keep in mind, you don't have to use just one per photo. You can combine them. In fact, I think your photographs are more powerful when you do combine them. So keep that in mind as you're doing your next composition It doesn't matter if you're indoors or outdoors, if you're doing portraits, travel, landscape, foods, whatever your subject is, keep these different elements of composition together. And I'm pretty sure you'll come up with a stronger photograph that your audience is going to love. Thank you so much for joining me here. If you like this video, please go ahead, click the like button. That tells YouTube if I'm doing something right. And subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. I have other things that I want to be able to share about photography. And hit the bell notification icon. You'll get notified the next time I put another video out. Thanks so much. We'll see you in the next video.